Welcome back to The Wisdom Within. I'm Lara Jaye. There are certain conversations that stay with me long after they've ended. Not necessarily because someone said something profound or because we uncovered a dramatic breakthrough. Often it's something much quieter than that. It's usually a question someone asks, almost in passing, and then days later, I find myself thinking about it while I'm walking on the beach or making my coffee. One of those questions has been following me around for years, and the question is this: why do I keep doing this? At first glance, it sounds like a question about behavior, but I've learned it's almost never that. It's about identity. It's about the moment someone begins to realize that there are patterns in their life they didn't consciously choose, yet somehow continue repeating them. Maybe it's the person who feels responsible for everyone else's happiness, but has no idea how to care for themselves without feeling guilty. Or maybe it's the woman who keeps saying yes when every part of her wants to say no. Or the man who works endlessly, not because anyone is asking him to, but because sitting still makes him strangely uncomfortable. Someone else may find themselves pulling away from relationships the moment they begin to feel vulnerable, while another keeps choosing partners who are emotionally unavailable and can't understand why the same story keeps unfolding with different people. Most of us assume these patterns simply describe who we are. We call ourselves independent, anxious, driven, perfectionistic, responsible, or overly sensitive. And eventually, those descriptions become part of our identity. We stop questioning them because they've been with us for as long as we can remember. But over the years, I've found myself asking a different question. And here it is. What if some of the things we've accepted as personality aren't actually personality at all? What if they're adaptations? And if so, that changes the conversation completely. When somebody hears the words generational trauma, they often picture extraordinary circumstances. They could imagine abuse, addiction, war, violence, or significant family dysfunction. Those experiences absolutely shape us, and they deserve to be acknowledged with great compassion. But I've become equally interested in something far less obvious. I've become interested in ordinary families. Families that loved one another, families that did the very best they could with what they knew, where no one intended to pass down pain, yet somehow passed down ways of living that made perfect sense at the time, but quietly continued long after they were needed. Because that's often how these patterns are handed from one generation to the next, not through intention, through normalization. Children don't learn only what they're told. They learn from what they live inside every single day. They learn what love looks like by watching how love is expressed. They learn what conflict feels like by watching how conflict is handled. They learn whether emotions are welcome, ignored, minimized, or avoided. They learn whether rest is valued or whether productivity quietly becomes the measure of a good life. No one has to explain these things. A child's nervous system is paying attention long before they have words to describe what they're absorbing. It's almost like learning a first language. None of us remember sitting down and studying vocabulary as toddlers. We simply listened, we watched, we repeated what was familiar until one day it became completely natural. And I sometimes wonder if family patterns are learned in much the same way. We don't wake up one morning and decide that our worth depends on being useful. We don't consciously choose to become hyper-independent or afraid of disappointing people. We don't sit down as kids and decide that being needed feels safer than having needs of our own. We simply adapt to the emotional environment we're given. And as children, these adaptations are remarkably intelligent. They help us stay connected to the people we depend upon. They help us find belonging, avoid conflict, earn approval, and create a sense of safety in situations that may have felt confusing or unpredictable, perhaps. The challenge is that our nervous system doesn't know the difference between what helped us survive at 8 years old and what allows us to thrive at 58. Unless we become curious enough to ask the question, does this still belong to me? Does this still belong to me? That's the question that has changed my own life more than any other. For a long time, I assumed one of my strongest qualities was simply that I had a good work ethic. I was proud of it, and in many ways I still am. I've been working since I was a little girl. Of course, babysitting, worked at the YMCA day camp, washed dishes at a local country club, cleaned houses. By the time I was 14, I had the keys to the local YMCA and opened the front desk on the weekends. Through high school, I also worked at the tanning salon, and somewhere in between all of that, I was looking for the next opportunity to earn a little money. Looking back now, what's interesting is that none of those jobs paid very much. If I recall correctly, I think minimum wage at the time was $3.10 an hour. And I remember in 1981 it getting bumped to $3.35 an hour, and what a big deal that was. So if making money had been my primary motivation, I probably would have been very disappointed. I loved knowing people could depend on me, and I loved contributing and feeling responsible. There was something deeply satisfying about knowing I had helped and that I had carried my part and I wasn't just taking up space in the world. At 12 years old, I certainly didn't have the language to understand why that mattered to me so much. I simply assumed this is who I am. I was a hard worker, I was dependable, I liked staying busy, end of story. Or at least that's what I believed for a very long time. It wasn't until much later in life that I began asking a different question. Was I working because I genuinely loved contributing? Or had I quietly learned that contributing was one of the ways I experienced my own worth? Those are two very different questions, and they don't necessarily have the same answer. The older I get, the more compassion I have for the younger version of myself. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't chasing success or building a resume. She was simply responding to the emotional environment she grew up in, just as all children do. We don't spend our childhood analyzing family dynamics or questioning the beliefs that surround us. We absorb them. They become as ordinary as the air we breathe. That's one of the reasons I think inherited patterns can be so difficult to recognize. We usually don't question what has always felt normal. When I look back now, I don't see parents who intentionally taught me that productivity determined my worth. I see two people who were doing the very best they could with the experiences that shaped them. They grew up in a generation that valued hard work, responsibility, sacrifice, and perseverance. Those qualities helped them build lives, raise families, and make it through challenges I can only begin to imagine. The interesting part is that every generation inherits both the gifts and the burdens of the one before it. I can see that every generation passes something to the next. Some of what we receive becomes an incredible gift. We inherit resilience, perseverance, generosity, loyalty, and a willingness to keep going when life becomes difficult. I wouldn't trade those qualities for anything because they've shaped much of who I am today. But every generation also passes along the strategies that once helped them survive. And sometimes those strategies are so woven into everyday life that no one recognizes them as survival. They simply become the way our family does things. Working hard becomes more than a value. It quietly becomes the measure of a person's character. Taking care of everyone else begins to feel more natural than asking for help yourself. Rest starts feeling uncomfortable, not because there's anything wrong with resting, but because somewhere along the way, Slowing down became associated with falling behind. None of this means our parents got it wrong. In fact, I think most parents are doing exactly what every generation has always done. They're passing on what helped them navigate the world they inherited. They're offering their children the very wisdom they believed would protect them, provide for them, and help them build a meaningful life. I find that perspective incredibly compassionate because it shifts us away from blame and towards understanding. So instead of looking backward with resentment, we can begin looking backwards with curiosity. We can appreciate the strengths we've inherited while also recognizing that some of the beliefs we carry, they were designed for a different time, a different generation, or a different set of circumstances. I started to ask myself a more meaningful question. Which parts of that inheritance still deeply feel true to who I am today? And which parts have simply been traveling with me for so long that I mistook them for my personality? Within a relatively short period of time, my mom passed away. And not long after that, two of my young nephews passed away unexpectedly 10 days apart from each other. I had also been traveling internationally, visiting one of my sons who was living in Japan for a couple of years. And as soon as I returned, I needed some emergency surgery. In between all of that, and by the time I flew home to Indiana for yet another funeral, I was running on a little more than adrenaline. I don't think I had even begun processing everything that had happened. I was simply trying to keep putting one foot in front of the other. When my dad met me, one of the first things he asked me was why I had spent the money to come home again instead of staying in Florida and working. And I remember thinking, how can this possibly matter right now? For years, I carried that conversation as evidence that my dad cared more about productivity than people. But time has a way of softening our perspective if we're willing to let it. I don't believe now that that conversation was really about money at all. I think my dad was speaking the only emotional language he had ever been taught. He grew up in a generation that believed you keep going. You worked, you showed up, you carried your responsibilities, even when life was unimaginably hard. And that's how his generation survived. Work wasn't simply something you did. It represented stability, responsibility, and safety. For years, I heard criticism. Today, I actually hear the word survival. Doesn't mean his words stopped hurting. It simply means I finally understood where they were coming from. It doesn't erase the hurt I felt in the moment, and it doesn't mean I suddenly saw everything through rose-colored glasses. It simply means I can now hold compassion for both experiences at the same time. I can acknowledge the impact his words had on me, also recognizing that he was handing me the very beliefs that had helped him navigate his own life. I carried some of those same beliefs into adulthood, mainly overworking. Children have an extraordinary ability to create stability inside unstable environments. And I can certainly see that becoming productive, dependable, and useful wasn't simply something that I enjoyed. It was one of the ways I created a sense of order in a world that often felt quite unpredictable. I measured myself by what I accomplished. I found it much easier to contribute than to receive. I believed I was simply describing my personality, when in reality, I was also living inside an inheritance I had never stopped to question. And I think that's why this conversation matters so much to me. To gently ask ourselves, is this belief helping me become more fully myself? Or is it asking me to continue carrying something that belonged to another generation? Because once we can see the difference, we no longer have to choose between honoring our family and honoring ourselves. We can do both. We can keep the resilience, the generosity, the perseverance, and the love. And we can also choose to set down the guilt, the over-responsibility, the fear, or the beliefs that no longer fit the life we are trying to create. To me, that's what healing has always been. Not rejecting where we've come from, understanding it deeply enough that we can consciously choose what we carry forward and what we're finally ready to leave behind. Perhaps that's all I'm really inviting you to consider today. Not whether your family got everything right or wrong, but whether there are beliefs, responsibilities, or ways of moving through life that have simply been traveling with you for so long that they've begun to feel like you. Maybe they are, but maybe they aren't. And I think they're worth becoming curious about, because awareness changes us. The moment we can see a pattern, we're no longer unconsciously living inside it. We suddenly have something we didn't have before. We have a choice. And sometimes that's where healing begins. As we move into today's light language transmission, I'd like to invite you to simply receive. There's nothing you need to do or figure out or force. My intention is not only to simply clear what no longer serves you, but also replace it immediately with more clarity, deeper trust, more peace, and whatever your highest wisdom knows that you need most in this moment. So today we'll gently release inherited beliefs, expectations, and those old survival patterns that no longer belong to you. And will strengthen your trust in your own inner wisdom. Begin to take a deep breath in and hold. Blow out. Do that a couple of more times. Caliondo de piondo, je le piotto de cliambo capioto je kayama. Yendo le pere que caletiingo cari yemo caribioco carimeo show. Calioto da de la caliondo da de andarindo de pioto nanicamo de je le blabriendo caribioco. Condo de andari caliandariinga caleti di calicaborio to je blabcoramayoko. Corindiri indiri clickety andari ga gariandari inga corindariumum Kyoto de la blabriindi yuko caribioco comanda calapioto. Corindiri di colipotapioto la caliandari inga calicai kanga coribioto di andari anda condo de la blabriindi yoko orandari kayoko meoto shakwa. Kiondo de le piotto calioto de piotto. Kiondo je le blabriende di colecorianda. Yimbo ga bore bediada di endedi ka yokore di coria probesh le qua. Caliondo de pioto de je le blabrienda de yako carende di inga. Kyoto de yapo carianda de coriata corabua. Take a deep breath in. And out. Come back into body awareness. Wiggle your fingers and toes. Your head. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and have a fantastic rest of your week.